Okay. As a start, can I also ask you each just to say and spell your name?
Cliff Sims, Simms.
Okay.
And Dorothea von Moltke, which is Dorothea VonMoltke.
Great. So eventually this will be a very conversational kind of give and take, largely about recent U.S. events and history, or global, I guess, too. But first, can I ask you, and you can be as elaborate or not as you'd like, and whoever wants to go first can go first, but can I ask you just to give a brief biographical sketch of kind of who you are, where you're from, where you've been, what you've done, what you're doing now?
Want me to start? So, I'm going all the way back. I was born in Buffalo, New York, and I've been back and forth a lot between mostly Germany and the U.S. Grew up in Germany, and then I came back for the end of high school to the U.S. in Vermont, and then went to Yale as an undergraduate. Graduated right when the wall came down, and so since it was possible to go to East Germany, I went, and those were pretty amazing years. And I worked. I went with a fairly loose idea of what I would do. I had some notion that I wanted to work in publishing, and so I went and found a journal that had come out of the revolution, and where there were a few names I recognized, and presented myself pretty cocky, thinking I had something to bring, and they seemed to think I did. And I spent a couple of years living in East Berlin, and then moved from working with that journal to working with immigrants, first Russian immigrants to East Germany, German ancestry Russian immigrants to East Germany. Very complex scene, politically very complex scene, and became more interested in the whole sort of the xenophobia of the time, the right wing.
This was around the time of the Turkish guest workers.
Yeah, but my focus was really on the East. So there it was guest workers with which the GDR had contacts: Mozambique, Angola, Vietnam, really. And there was a group. There was one. I don't know if you remember. In '89, there were all these roundtables, and as a sort of experiment in that small window where there was talk of a third way between socialism and capitalism, and roundtables were part of that. And I was incredibly fascinated by that idea. And there was one such roundtable that still existed when I, when I was more involved in those political issues in 1991, and that was a roundtable against xenophobia in Eastern Germany. So I started working with them, was their managing director, did projects, and then became pretty overwhelmed with what I was doing. I felt very young doing what I was doing, unprepared. Maybe one always feels unprepared, but I felt very unprepared. Unsure what would make me feel more prepared, convinced that reading and writing is an obvious answer to that. And so I applied for graduate school, and I went to and started graduate studies in German literature at Columbia, which is where Cliff and I met. Cliff was a part owner of a bookstore, Book Forum. I don't know if you remember Book Forum. Yeah. Across from Columbia. And I when I started graduate school, I had a loose idea that publishing would remain interesting to me. It was fairly clear to me that I didn't want to be sort of solidly in academia, but I like to be find a way to be tangentially in academia. Again, not quite knowing how one would do that, but I was lucky to have really supportive advisors and professors. Supportive also when we opened our first bookstore, which was, you remember Labyrinth in New York? Did you know?
Yeah, the Columbia location. Yeah.
Right, and Cliff will fill in the pieces of the what other projects we had going at the time, and first kid. Nora was born 6 weeks after we opened the Columbia bookstore. So by then, life in New York had become pretty thick, and and I didn't finish my dissertation. Then got more and more, more fully involved with the bookstore, and I've become a bookseller over time. Doing, defining. We've been defining more and more who does what, and I've sort of grown into different roles at the store. And now here in Princeton, it's really, really what I'm doing is running the Princeton store with Cliff and all our people there.
Let me just retrieve a thread that might be running through. Your parents were both from Germany?
Yeah.
And how and when did they come to the U.S.?
Also unlinear. My father, both my father's and my mother's families are from. My father's family is from Silesia, and his mother, my grandmother, had to flee after the war. Both my grandfathers were part of the resistance in Germany, and so my father's mother left Germany at the end of the war, and for South Africa, where there was extended family, and then returned to Berlin. Fell in love again in the 50s with a professor here in the U.S. at Dartmouth, which is where Vermont comes in.
Oh, okay.
And so my father, as a student, started being in the U.S. quite a bit. He eventually became an environmentalist, and when that wasn't really when there wasn't really any such thing in Germany, and was a pretty exciting time for that particular interest. And then my parents moved in my sophomore year, my junior year of college, to Vermont, and I moved with them. So I had a year and a half of high school, and that was when my mother hadn't been in the U.S. Except to visit until. No, it's not true. What am I saying? I was born here. So their back and forth is that my father was, before being an environmentalist, my father was a professor of history in Buffalo. I'm skipping the 60s. How could I? How outrageous. Which is when I was born. So they were in Buffalo. Yeah, my father was here as a student and then returned as a young professor to Buffalo. And we weren't there long, but it was 68, so 68 in Buffalo was a pretty interesting time, actually. Yeah. And then he switched careers at a moment when he was offered tenure very early out of that time, and I think panicked at the idea of a predictable life. And so up and left, at that point, I had a twin brother and a 2-year older brother, so we were really little, and that little family just went back to Germany.
Yeah. So, the thing that struck me was, it sounded as though one might plausibly say that you lived as an immigrant in 2 different countries. Did it feel that way? Kind of German in America and American in Germany, or how did that work out?
I've had moments of feeling those things, but I think I'm identified as my first language is German, and my childhood was really solidly in Germany, and so I think that I didn't ever feel to be an immigrant in Germany. That has something to do with the fact that my family's history is very deeply woven into German history through all kinds of facets. Going back to the Franco-Prussian Wars and then World War II, and so there. I think in terms of my own identity, that was always pretty clear. What I had to grapple with.
Right. So where did your interest in the immigration issue come from when you were in Germany later on? As what do you say, a young adult or
just
college
out of
age?
College, just out of college at the end. it was what was happening. It was clearly the thing that was troubling Berlin and Germany in that moment, and it was it was the most confusing thing for me in the East, because in the East there really wasn't any, there was no diversity or experience of diversity whatsoever. The guest workers there all lived in a very ghettoized way and weren't integrated at all, and yet this right-wing nationalism was very, very strong and had a kind of neo-Nazi, always had a neo-Nazi wing to it that was a pretty big deal. And I grew up in a very politically aware and historically aware family and household. It was sort of a given that you try to understand what the contemporary questions are, and then it's always who you end up meeting. It's always relationships, right? So I met people that interested me, and for me at least, that's how my choices truly are always made through who the issues connect to. And I met people that interested me, and came out of that.
Okay. Cliff, so how do you get from birth to the book forum and then beyond?
I was born in Women's Hospital in East New York, Brooklyn, and we lived there until the late 60s, when there was that mass migration of Jews and Italians from places like East New York to Long Island. And my parents were very working class. My father's a window cleaner. My mom worked in dress shops all her life. And I grew up, I would say, mostly in the streets in Brooklyn, which was lots of fun at the time. Full of kids in the 60s and safe and wonderful. So all those portrayals of, dangerous urban stuff, it's just not true. My parents, had some dream about owning their own house.
Were they both from Brooklyn?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they grew up there. And they had some dream about owning their own house, and when they finally did, I think they found it lonely, isolating, and not having the resources to deal with all of a sudden a nuclear family, right? From an extended family that you had of friends and relatives. So, and I think it's only today they realize actually what they sacrificed for this vision of upward mobility, but what they gave up, the contents of what they gave up for a certain form. But I grew up there and went to high school. And
which town was it?
Oceanside.
Oceanside, okay.
Which is the South Shore, near Long Beach. And just at the time when schools were exploding, the end of the baby boom. So, my graduating class had, 2,500 students. You had to graduate A to K, J to Z. And people didn't know whether you were there or not there. It was a lot of public school education. It was just a kind of warehousing. But I was lucky enough to, no one in my family ever went to college. And I was lucky enough to be a really, really good soccer player. And wound up, through a friend of the family, going to Columbia, which my parents hated the idea of going back to the city. There's Brooklyn, and then there's the city. But it was great. It was a great experience in the late 70s, and there were lots of great people, and for the first time in my life, what you thought and how you could articulate it mattered. And I studied comparative literature and English and philosophy, and I studied with Edward Said and Sidney Morgenbesser and Robert Cummings, and and it just opened up a world of things that, hadn't been apparent at all, hadn't been present. And it was great. It was also a time at universities where, or at least at Columbia, where everything wasn't so, familial, where they brought you in and took care of you. It was, much more like you're in New York, you find it yourself. Uh-huh. And so it was a great experience. So you went to hear jazz at the West End all the time, and you went to places outside of the university, which were an education in themselves. And afterwards, I got this crazy scholarship to Cambridge, and went to study political philosophy. Mm-hmm. And that was a mixed experience. I never quite felt like I belonged in the university, and it's always been kind of a stretch. And there it was very hard because the emphasis was on a kind of debating, not about what you thought about a position, but what you could withstand in the immediate give and take of a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I was never quite sure whether anybody believed in what they were saying, or were just literally debating. Mm-hmm. So I spent 2.5 years there and came back and didn't really know whether I should continue or wanted to continue. So I went to the New School and took courses with people like Agnes Heller and Ferenc Fair, these ex-students of Lukács, mm-hmm. these Hungarian exiles. And the philosophy program there is one of the few continental philosophy programs.
And in those years, the New School still really had that kind of refugee kind of feel to it, didn't it?
Yeah, completely. And it had, it had these people who had these experiences, and so when you worked on metacritiques of the theory of justice, you read everybody. Mm-hmm. It was both demanding, in the sense, intellectually demanding, in the sense of who these people were and what they had done and mastered, and in that way, it was just it was fun. It was really challenging and fun, but it was hard to figure. A lot of they had also other issues about accreditation and things like that. But the people there were incredible, and I met lots of people. And at the time, to sustain myself in New York, I started working part-time in bookstores. Mm-hmm. There was National Books on Astor Place, run by these Romanian refugees, who were the first ones to develop the idea that, because they were so worried, in the early 80s about people stealing books, they were the first ones to recognize that you could just put the cover of the book out, kind of like the CD case or the sleeve of a record, not realizing that it's no fun to browse. But that was fun, and it was, for me, it was a great time in New York, because you could basically, there were still margins in Manhattan where you could live very cheaply. Mm-hmm. So I lived in Hell's Kitchen, 4-room, cold water flats basically that were built in the teens for working class, and for very cheap. And you met just an infinite array of people. And as I started to work in bookshops, there was also at the time a generation, basically, of very left, Trotskyites, ex-Trotskyites, Fourth International, and I would have to say that, like Melville says of whaling, it was, the whale ship was my Harvard and Yale, that bookstores served that role. Mm-hmm. In some ways. You were educated, you were constantly confronted by people asking you whether you had read something, and it coincided also with the time of the translation and import of a lot of European theory, mm-hmm. To the States, when, popular publishers like Random House could publish notes from the from mm-hmm. the Second International, and Althusser was published by HarperCollins, and so there was an idea that it wasn't so marginal. Mm-hmm. A lot of the stuff that was coming out, and it was also the time of Radical Historians Group had formed before, and lots of journals were in their youth and very active, and so it was always a great experience, really. And
so when did you first get the idea that you would go into business for yourself?
I didn't. I worked for almost a decade, and I worked up then at Columbia almost for a decade. And what really gave me the idea was that it got to be very strange that being right across the street, Book Forum was right across the street from the main entrance of Columbia University, but the idea of being a scholarly bookstore really just wasn't around. The idea of, sure, you carried some university press stuff and you carried good books, but the idea that you could be in dialogue with the university, and scholars would be interested, it wasn't around, mostly because the people that owned bookstores really weren't booksellers in lots of ways. People who worked in them were, but the people who owned them were often, one of a different generation. A lot of them were almost anti-intellectual. They had come upon it almost accidentally, selling it as if you were selling any commodity.
Right, the books could have been raisins, right?
The books could have been raisins, and it gave them a disdain for the people who thought that the books were something, who worked for them. So it was only then that I thought this could work in a very different way, and because we had no money, and the guy who was owned Book Forum was floundering, basically, and just making a mess of it. We had some opportunity to become a junior partner, which was crazy and stupid, and but the only opportunity around, really, at the time. And basically, we just had to live through that for 5 years.
So the first Labyrinth was established in what year?
97.
97, okay.
Yeah.
So, these have been wild times in bookselling in general. Just, with the kind of the onslaught of the Barnes and Nobles of the world, and then the onslaught of Amazon.
The internet.
So can you just talk about being business people in that climate?
Well, yeah.
Go ahead. No.
No, I think...
well, not just business people, but, booksellers especially, but also business people.
I think we think the interesting thing about bookselling is that bookselling has been in the forefront of the new economy. Earlier, maybe music is the only other commodity, but books and music have been in the forefront of the new economy longer than any other commodities around. And if you want to get an idea of what that economy is, books can really show you a paradigm. It's thankless, deflationary. To do it, you have to be against the culture. And the changes have been very fast, if you think about it, and drastic. And most people think now that it's simply about the way things circulate, that the internet, as a metaphor for this change, is about just the circulation of books, how you can buy them, how you can see them. But it's not. It's really about how things are produced, how they're consumed, and the very types of labor, that are valorized or not. And I think, that's been difficult to live through. But I don't think it's very different than a lot of other institutions. Than what's happened to a lot of other institutions. We've all, in some ways, started out on this journey thinking that these are the kinds of things we'd like to do and the kind of social relations that we'd like to have. And when you get there, the institution has changed. What bookselling has changed a lot. There's much too much competition. There's much too much overproduction. But worst of all, I think there's a general, very anti-intellectual perception that books are expensive, which has to do with how marginal they are as an entertainment. And I also think that a lot that's driving it is actually in the long run undermining itself. So if you look at the internet and the idea, there's a lot of boosterism about creating, readers, and it doesn't matter what you read. But really you have had 600 years of print culture, right, that they're cannibalizing. But you can't say that they're creating readers in the way that print culture created readers. People are reading. what they're reading, I think, changes. And maybe it's simply that the book will change. But what we've seen, I think, a lot is that the experience of what it means to be a reader has changed, and the time that people have or don't have any longer has changed, the value of that experience. Don't you think?
Yeah, sure. I think that, in terms of the business of all of this, one of the challenges has always been, and maybe we should explain a little bit what we've tried to do to survive, right? At a time when bookstores are constantly going out of business, and I think what we from the beginning have attempted is also to exploit the irrationalities of the book market against itself, and so we have the stores, but before opening our first store, we started Great Jones Books, which, do you know?
No.
Great Jones Books is it's a wholesale company for what are called hurts and remainders. So there's this overproduction of books, and mostly the chain stores, all bookstores, but mostly the chain stores keep anything on the shelf for about as long as it takes the yogurt to spoil, and then return to publishers what hasn't sold. So the life of a book is really, really short, and in the public, and those books don't get reintegrated by publishers. They get sold off at auction as hurts and remainders, and when did we start Great Jones? So this is now, we're talking
95.
In 95. I mean, Cliff, the other thing that he did while being a bookseller is compulsively buy books. So when I met Cliff, he had this apartment. He had moved out of Hell's Kitchen and up to the Upper West Side.
On 106th in Riverside Drive, facing the river, but you couldn't see out the windows because the book boxes were stacked so high.
Extremely nice apartment.
Who cares about the view?
Yeah, right. And the cat was sort of, hopping along underneath the ceiling somewhere. So this became somewhat untenable. And we started looking around, really looking for a place to store the books. And Yonkers there was this sort of a redevelopment of Yonkers going on, and we were shown this really extraordinarily beautiful old carpet factory in Yonkers with very cheap space, but lots of it. So you couldn't just you couldn't just rent, a small corner. But it was not a small corner that we had.
We started renting 3,000 square feet.
That's not a small corner. I mean, that was way more than we needed for what we had. And it was, one of these brick and steel and glass buildings. So there now was extra space which fed Cliff's proclivity to buy books. And there, having been a bookseller at that point already for quite some time, Cliff was very, very clued into the market of remainders, and that's something that you were doing at Book Forum already, is buying and selling remainders. Because I don't think either of us ever had an interest in anything bibliophile, The idea was to make books, find good books and make them as cheap as is sustainable so that they can find their readers.
We still have that idea as print, as print wanes in importance and publishers want to just keep their titles for digital rights. We'd be happy to just reprint them at lower prices.
Yeah. So this whole thing started, I think, with these Yale University Press art books that Cliff heard about and wanted. But the thing about remainder books is you have to then buy them when you bid on them, and if you win the bid, you have to buy the full quantity, which is often a truckload. And so I don't know that we really so much wanted to win that bid, but I guess maybe
we wanted to win it. We just didn't know how to pay for it.
Right. So exactly. So we wanted to win it, and we did win it, and then we went and we begged, borrowed, and stole. And from that purchase, then we started this thing of buying books and keeping for a not quite defined future purpose what we thought was best. And this was mostly Cliff doing, and at that point I was really writing my dissertation. And selling the rest to other booksellers
So
internationally.
the market for remainders is really booksellers.
Yeah, all of our customers at Great Jones are other stores.
It's wholesale. It's a wholesale company.
Yeah.
But then when we started having conversations with Columbia about opening a bookstore, we essentially had this inventory of books that we thought were excellent, that with which to begin to stock that store, and the relationship of Great Jones as a kind of supply chain for our own bookstores can't be overstated. The importance of that can't be overstated for our project. So, on the one hand, this general shift that we've been talking about, it forces you to define a niche. If you're going to exist somewhere as a small independent place, I think you do have to get to understand where your niche economy is.
There aren't really any.
Well, being an academic bookseller is its own kind of niche, and what we do we couldn't do except near universities, and so it became a pretty particular business model, right? On the one hand, pretty specialized, though I think we've become a little less arrogant over time. I hope we've become more inclusive, and we also have more room. In the more space. We now have this luxury of space, but I think also less arrogant. And but then with this added piece of books through Great Jones, and not only so that's a way of competing for price, right? You buy these at auction for anywhere between 50 cents and a buck to
10%.
Right.
I bought that class.
At very deep discount, and then you can still sell them at a really deep discount to your customers and have a good margin. So that's really been important. You can start to compete for discounts certainly with chain stores and even online, but on books that are disappearing elsewhere. So the other side is that you extend the life of the book, which is really something.
That's really the central part. The central part is when chains came in, the Barnes and Noble started expanding. There was the fantasy that these superstores would have everything, and that's the idea.
They have everything for about a minute.
Right.
For less than a minute.
And not everything. There's so much that doesn't get tried.
But we do have to remember there was that moment where, even Victor Navasky wrote an editorial in the New York Times saying that this was the new public sphere because there were couches. Right. This was the Habermasian public sphere.
Starbucks at Barnes & Noble was the new cafe.
A couch, right. So, there was that idea, but they ran into the same problems, that bookstores run into, all brick-and-mortar bookstores, and they've just constantly kept contracting the number of titles. Mm-hmm. And the irony in the book business has been, in the last 20 years, is they keep printing more titles. People actually show fewer titles, and that irrationality is just not reconciled at all, except you see it online as the cheapness of yesterday's books, which really is detrimental, to everybody. But the chains, and now that fantasy that the chains couldn't fulfill has spread to the internet, right? That they have it all, that it's all there. Whether they actually have it or not, it doesn't really matter. But the real fantasy that governs it is price. It's not even convenience any longer. The difficulty is competing on price with a business, and you really need to talk about Amazon, which may or may not be making any money off of actual selling of new books. And driving the price down is obviously destructive for the industry as a whole. You're not creating new readers by selling books more cheaply, and the books that are the biggest books in the industry now, nobody makes any money off of. Luckily, we don't sell them anyway, the bestsellers and stuff. but nobody makes any money, which can't be healthy for book selling. You know, and there really isn't an answer to it because price governs so much,
Right.
you know, in the marketplace that it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle, right? And the other development that I think has been, I think, detrimental on our side of the business, which is completely unique to book selling, is in more, you know, university press and scholarly things, this idea that because of this notion of the long tail, you know, the idea that things will keep selling even if it's in very small numbers and it doesn't cost very much to keep it in print, but the price can keep going up. So you have this phenomena where a book was published for $14.95 10 years ago, and now in paperback from a university press it's $82.50, and you're wondering, in what other industry is it that
You
know,
don't sell
last
the
year's
suit.
stuff that doesn't sell
Let's make
goes
it
up in
happen.
price? You know, and it's not about readers. It's not, you know, it's an abstract
Right.
financial formula, which, you know, it's hard to make sense of as a long-term policy.
Yeah.
So,
Well, a couple of questions. I mean, one is, given all of the challenges in book selling over the last 2 decades and more now, does what happened to the rest of the economy in 2008 even make a blip in kind of what you're facing? Like, and if so, like, how do you see that? How does that manifest itself in your business?
Yeah, it makes it more than a blip because what Cliff was just talking about price becomes even more exclusively the overarching and one determining factor in choice. So you have people who, you know, there even people who sort of have an understanding that of the role of an independent bookseller in a community, but with sort of expendable income being less in the recession, people stand in our store all the time with their handheld devices, and of course you can't discover something you're not already looking for on the internet. So that is one of the roles a bookstore still plays, is that you come across it, you didn't know it existed, you didn't know, you weren't looking for it, but you found it, and you know, and it ended up being just what you were looking for. So they come, they find something they didn't know about, and they stand in the store and they order it on Amazon right there and then. So
that's students.
because no, it's not only students. It's a lot of students, but it's not only students. And so there's a you know, the recession has driven more and more of the business to the internet for sure.
But I think it's, yeah, and I think what you see everywhere in this recession is that, ironically, at least at the beginning, things have become more financialized. You know, finance caused the recession, but the effect is that there's a greater speed up to make up for it. I mean, you can't really forget that, you know, at the basis of the last 15 years has been the speed up in everybody's life. And we see it in book selling, less browsing, less time to read. I mean, you hear that from readers, I really don't have time. And that goes along with less wonder, exactly what Dorothea is saying, at the things that you didn't know you need until you stumble upon them, which, you know, has been a source for us always of, you know, it's where the imagination lives, right? But what I think has happened and continues to happen is that there hasn't been a reaction against that yet. You know, whether it's going to local bookstores or shopping online, what there hasn't been is the idea that life has to change in very fundamental ways. You know, you have to revalue those values in some ways. And for bookstores, it would be slowing down, you know. But the entertainments that we like and everything in the culture, you know, is about fragmenting attention and, you know, doing more.
And you know, I mean, another effect that's and some of these effects from the, you know, some of the fallout from of this economic crisis is it doesn't manifest right away, but it's kind of trickling down. So the publishing industry that really created self-fulfilling prophecies by firing entire departments, and always not always, but very, very often the people to go are the ones who have the larger salaries, meaning the ones that are more experienced, meaning the ones who actually have more book knowledge, etc.
And editors.
And editors. So we the quality of our bookstore depends also on the quality of books that are being published, and that's now, I feel like the last season was the first where it was really palpable that you saw, damn, they really just got rid of their best people, and so their books aren't as good. And it does get more and more depressing each season to go through the catalogs and see what's being published and what the values there, what the cultural values there are. And when you have a hard time getting excited about anything in the Knopf catalog, that's the one you look forward to looking at, right? So it's not good.
It's funny. I was just at the London Book Fair, and I was lucky enough to get there and get home. But since nobody else was there and could get there,
because of the
volcanic.
The thing that didn't happen here. They have these show dailies. So for the first time, I think, in 20 years, I read it. And one of the facts that was fascinating was, for the first time in America last year, over 1 million titles were published. Of those 1 million titles, 700,000 were self-published.
Isn't that amazing?
And I didn't quite know what to do with that. It's not as if people are writing, but it's like blogging. Everybody can write, but what writing is becoming is not rewriting, not editing, not having other people or yourself as editor in the rewriting process. It's just throwing stuff out there, printing it immediately, and whether it's read or not becomes almost, just a very arbitrary thing, because it can't be. There's just too much of it.
And then you have, this shift towards the ebook, which, all those developments, I think, were also accelerated and are being accelerated by publishers feeling financially strapped. Now, is it cheaper to publish ebooks? By all accounts, no. And yet there's...
Well,
some are, but I mean,
it's about 15% cheaper.
If you start. If you start. I mean, I just was I'm on the board at Rutgers University at the press, and they were saying no. By their calculations, it's really not cheaper, especially because you have to invest so much money also in electronics and in databases, and that's very skilled, very expensive labor, and so on. So it's really, I think that the verdict is out on whether it's cheaper to publish ebooks or not. But it's happening. There's a kind of what's it called? Tail wagging the dog moment there, where everyone is actually confused, skeptical, doubtful, and yet throwing their lot in with that future, and so that's another development that is very real, and we have to understand it and come to terms with it and not be Luddites about it, and so I think I would say that a kind of consistent challenge has been in these years of these projects that we've done. There are these cycles of disillusionment, right, that you go through, and maybe part of that are also just your own cycles of growing up, because there's also that you become an adult that way too. But these are very synchronized in our experience with these moments of profound economic and cultural shifts in what we do. And so how do you deal with that disillusionment and not live in a kind of zone of disappointment, which is no way to live, right? And sometimes we do better at it, and sometimes worse. But I think we're pretty aware of it, of that being the task, right? To see where meaning in your day-to-day then comes from,
right.
and as the scope of that meaning, goes from something quite romanticized or romantic, or I don't know how to. Maybe that's not a good adjective. I don't even know. But something,
No,
but something that really felt relevant and like an intervention in the culture.
It's hard.
And
It's hard not to find resonances in what you do, right? So when it falls on deaf ears, or even at dinner parties, you can bring up books that, it's hard. It's hard. We're all not reading nearly the same things, no matter how important somebody tells you it is. And I think the other, part of that, has been that you constantly have to gear yourself up for why you're doing what you're doing, despite being disillusioned.
Right.
That there's a cultural struggle there, but you're not really sure what the subject of the struggle is, besides the personal one.
Or that it amounts to much, or that it will still be there in 10 years, or what its future is, or that anyone cares, or that you could make a really good argument for why someone should care. Especially where could we still be the kinds of booksellers that we are? Anywhere outside of Princeton? Not likely. Outside of these or Yale, or there are very few places. Now these, in the scheme of things, does it matter?
But that's also it doesn't take into account how those places are changing. I mean, there might only be a few places, right, that you can do that, and yet it's not like doing it 10 years ago or 15 years ago at these same places.
Right, for sure not.
Because of the communities and how they've changed at these places. And I think it's fascinating to have a discussion about that with these communities. It's hard to do.
Right.
We're lucky enough here actually to be able to do that.
Well, tell me about what those changes look like from behind your counter. Because I have very strong ideas about, from the inside of the institution and from the professor's podium. I can talk about those changes, but it'd be interesting to know kind of the changes that you're talking about and how they register.
Well, I think I can give it to you anecdotally first. When we opened at Columbia, I saw people that I was a student of for years and years, and was part of the community for years and years, once or twice a week on their way home in the shop, who only wanted to know what was new, what was important, what should they read, and they bought it. And look, we all at some point, who've loved books, scholars do that, whether we get to it or not, but the aspiration to get to it, right, is formative in some way. You see people less and less. People's lives are taken up with, we know some of the changes in the university. We know, displacement of faculty into administration and those things, and meetings, and and it's not as if people don't come by, it's just quite literally they don't have time, and the reaction is almost much more oppressive. Why are you showing me all these things that I know I'm not going to get to?
Because it's a professionalization,
right?
The professionalization of the academy has meant the narrowing of everybody's scope, which means there's a narrowing of what people share in terms of interest and what they can talk about, and we've seen very real shifts in academic departments and disciplines, and those we pay close attention to them. So when we started the store in Columbia, we had a wall of literary theory. This was the moment of literary theory. It's where philosophy had its home in literary theory, right? And we had a long wall. That was
18 bookcases
of literary theory. Now we have 6, right? And
that's a lot.
And you're hard pressed to find the 6 that you'd still want to read.
Yeah, for sure. And we have a wall still of Western philosophy, but we
constantly hear who cares about that stuff? Give
Yeah.
me analytic
Yeah,
stuff.
all the
Give
time.
me logic.
So our own interests that that also are reflected in the store are more out of sync, more and more out of sync with, and then you tread that sort of balance of, as a bookseller, you have to also represent the current debates, but we're invested in keeping something alive that's not so current,
that's right?
And we think that just putting books in front of people is one small such way.
The irony, those debates are still current. It's not that the debates have been superseded. Yeah, I mean, there are other debates. There's, neurophilosophy.
No, by current, I just mean, what is going on in the academy.
Sure.
And,
no, that's true.
And we carry a notion that's out of sync often.
Right.
And then there are people that are sort of happily synchronized with your out of syncness, and they're happy to come into your store, and then there are others who just come in and say, well what's this, and don't quite understand. Especially kids are interesting, students are a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but not so drastically, actually. I mean, you both are so historically aware. I mean, you were talking about New York at a very particular moment, and you were talking about Berlin at a very particular moment. Let's talk about this particular moment and kind of how you're seeing it, not only kind of from the vantage point of booksellers, but also just as people who think about history and think about culture as much as you do. One of the things that's been really striking is that, I mean, I've talked to all kinds of people across the country, and there's a real, pretty broad consensus that this is an extraordinary moment in U.S. history. But there's no consensus at all about what's extraordinary about it or what's important about it or what even the phrase "our current moment" might mean. I mean, so when I say that phrase to you, I mean, what is the compound that kind of forms this moment that we're in? What are the important things about it, or how does the world look to you right now?
I would actually say that it's a dire moment. I think it is this moment of utter disillusionment, both in American culture and in American society. I wouldn't say it's been realized yet. There's still, I think, the fantasy that the day before the recession can come back in any moment, and all it takes is sort of reinflating some balloon. And that's not just a kind of common fantasy. I think that's an elite. I mean, the crazy thing is it's an elite fantasy because there really isn't an answer to that swell of problems and contradictions that we've been living under. So all of the things that govern, I think, the culture, the culture of consumption, which, in some ways you can say has had something to do with dampening politics, some form of politics or progressive politics, or, it's hard to see it's hard for me to see what actual good can come out of this moment. And I feel, on the one hand, there's a lot of cynicism by elites, and I think the inequalities are so great today as to be insurmountable. And I think they're creating a different kind of culture at this very moment. So we can talk about foreign policy, and but what you have at one moment is it doesn't look like there's going to be a recovery in jobs. It doesn't look like, if the private sector I wouldn't rely on, the government isn't hiring, universities and public spheres are not hiring. So it's hard to say.
And no one ever talks about wages. I mean, there's unemployment and then there's wages too, right? So
and
even those who have jobs, can they live on one job?
Mm-hmm.
And, so,
well, that's the other thing about the last round of globalization. That, the last round of globalization, it's really the 70s on. If wages haven't gone up, what does that mean for this incredible American fantasy of upward mobility? And to me, the real political question is what happens when that reality sets in, and it begins to set in. And there's a positive dimension of that setting in, because so much of that life was unsustainable. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot of people looking for a new form that it can take, and a new form of being social, and a new, and you see it in local movements and green movements and all the alternative movements. For me, one of the problems is with those things are that there's still an older notion of it has to be a little more collective. There has to be, a little bit more of a universalist vision of a common good and what that means. And it's hard to imagine this country when so much of the rhetoric is still about, and I mean the liberal rhetoric, is so much about dismantling government, the market can do it, and, nothing's happened. Healthcare hasn't been solved in any way. It's really been almost deferred,
So I'm curious, if you, it sounds like in your conversations, people really feel there's a kind of maybe not balance, but there are really both elements, a soberness, but somehow also a sense of possibility.
Well, I think that.
So where do they? For me, the Obama moment was, unbelievable as an experience.
We'll talk more about that.
Of hope in the political arena, and of sort of an identification that you've gotten very used to thinking you just could never have, with anything happening in the mainstream of politics, and so there was it was thrilling. It was a thrilling. I was certainly, we have friends who then too were skeptical. I was more hopeful than skeptical, for sure.
So can you talk about the arc from that initial hope to wherever it is that you're right now?
Yeah, I'm not not running so high anymore.
But you should talk about what the hope was for, because it wasn't simply, it wasn't simply to bring in a new politics. It was for a political truth that would be disillusioning, that would get you out of this impasse.
Yeah, there's sort of a courage of your convictions kind of time, and with enough strength in numbers, you could have the courage of your convictions and avert some really looming disasters, and maybe while you're averting disaster, actually build something good and have a formative experience. None of us in this room has had that kind of, I don't think. For me, 89 in some ways, but it wasn't my 89, I wasn't in the East. So 89 was certainly a marker experience, but, we haven't had the sort of 60s experience or whatever, where your convictions get, and who you, I think that there was a real sense that maybe, something less predictable could be going on, and you could, and with lots of openings for finding a role in that, and something very participatory, and so that to me was.
So what happened?
What didn't happen? I mean, Afghanistan, and one could say that. Maybe the need for it to look the way it looked was so great that I couldn't see what it actually already was. I don't know that.
Asking Obama to be the carrier of so much is, of course, the wrong, not only the wrong question, but the wrong hope.
But remember, we kept saying, we kept saying to each other during the elections, of course he'll fail. We kept saying, we kept saying there's no way
he can. We said we hoped he would fail in the tragic way that you expect of great politicians. That they confront you with an irresolvable contradiction and they take the right side, and of course they're either voted out of office or assassinated, or they're overwhelmed, by a populace that can't deal with it. But the difference is they create this opening where all of a sudden reality floods through and you realize something has to change. Real change has to take place. And then a groundswell, may happen or may not. But in playing basically electoral politics, which Obama has, with the ideas that he came with, he still, it's so much part of the time, as Marx says in the 18th Brumaire, you're using an old language and giving it new meaning here. So you take healthcare, but you've gutted it of the really radical changes, and then you say, I've accomplished something. And, whether it's all he could do or who knows. But the point is, it's not transforming the politics at all. And it's not meant to in some ways. And that's, for me, that's the real disappointment. But it also is a sobering lesson in that's not how politics should be transformed from the top down. That it's got to be from the bottom up. And that's one of the difficulties of his election. It is great to sign petitions online. It is great, to be able to click onto something. But maybe it is still different to be out in the streets. Maybe it does still mean something to power to see a mobilization in the streets, which is different than,
But then you have, we had Nader at the store, right? Who's just written this book, Only the Super Rich Can Save Us. I don't know if you've seen it.
A novel.
So who is basically preaching top-down solutions, and as the only, at this point, given the urgency of things, the only possibility. So I don't know. It's I keep thinking that that probably for me, in retrospect, I think that that there was such a need to think Obama was who we wanted him to be, that I think it was all hidden in plain sight, or not even hidden. I don't think that. We knew where he stood on gun control, and we knew where he stood on Afghanistan, and we knew these things. And look, I think still, I can't even say that. You look at the immigration bill. That friends who know a lot more about this than I do are saying that the immigration bill that Obama has been discussing is basically a Republican bill and a package of, and so then what, where is their leadership? Disarmament, signing these pacts with Russia that are they're meaningless as far as I can see, and so foreign policy. Is it still a lesser evil? Yeah, it's a lesser evil. Is he more? Can he write a better speech? Yes, but I'm actually getting pretty bored with the rhetoric of his speeches, and skeptical of the power of rhetoric when it's divorced from policy, and so there's a.
It strikes me, though, in the question all of a sudden that we're constantly inclined, right, in America, to think about the present, this moment, and that the moment is, we have to live through 2001, being, a historical moment,
right.
That changed everything. But the real crisis can be that this moment can last 30 or 40 years in a slow decline. Or slow transformation that we would like to be precipitous in some way, but it's not. And while I think it's, actually, what I wonder about now is the younger generation, kids, approaching college age, kids, who are confronted with really who've grown up in a very individualized society, who have taken on huge amounts of debts or have seen their opportunities curtailed, who will never live as well as their parents, right? And for whom the message, what effect that has, on their life. What does that make them as subjects and citizens? And I don't
right,
know.
and what are their available models also?
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's hard. I don't know. It's hard to have a lot of enthusiasm. Seems kind of, or optimism seems kind of just an empty gesture. Not because there aren't lots of experiments, but it's the same thing that we talked about in a lot of professions today, right? Teaching, things like that. It's not amplified in a way that it becomes a model for living. There's no media to actually, trumpet it into saying this is a way to live. And there are no institutions or fewer institutions to take it up, not none. But so the question is, how does the message go out, and how do these struggles, because they're taking place, but how do they get amplified so that they can be on a scale that others can take solace from it, or courage, or something.
Right.
So I find it actually a really confusing moment, and not because I'm not sure whether it's hopeful or not hopeful. I think it's a totally sober moment. But what's confusing about it is that it doesn't take much to describe the ways in which things are difficult and dangerous and tracked in a pretty bad way. But what's confusing and difficult is to know how to live that, and to know what conclusions to draw, and
right.
to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been hearing from different people, I think that the kind of continuing, I won't call it hope in Obama, but there's a continuing, like a real love of him as a figure, and I think part of it owes to the thing that people see him as holding at bay. And, the opposition to Obama has been a kind of impressive force. And I'm just curious, kind of first of all, have you seen anything on the right that has taken you by surprise in the last, whatever it's been now, year and a half? Or was this all part of the kind of what was hidden in plain sight and what we should have known all along? And where does that opposition fit in the overall equation of how we're thinking about Obama's accomplishments, or what it is that we're asking of him?
I think I wouldn't. I mean, the form of the opposition, say the Tea Party movement, how vocal it is, how I would even say the Republican Party. You didn't think it could go to the right, but it has publicly gone to the right. But I wonder if there's anything very new about that, because it seems to me that it's still playing out, even generationally. These old forces, I would say from Nixon, right? The great silent majority of suburbanites, that Agnew talks about, from Reagan, this anti-government thing, and the last almost 40 years of bashing government and of not assailing, everything from white supremacy, to these fundamentalist movements, and what kind of a coalition is it? I don't know, but a very interesting philosopher, Gillian Rose, says that, the interesting thing about post-'89 is we get to talk again about the relationship between liberalism and fascism. We couldn't talk about that before '89 because communism came in. But now we can talk about it. And so all of this talk today about, even Obama's, about consensus, finding a consensus amongst parties. There is a consensus. There aren't very many real conservatives anymore. So everyone is liberal on the economy, and just has conservative cultural values. But that is the consensus, and unfortunately there isn't enough, it seems to me, of a progressive movement to really combat that consensus in America. And it is a very... the one thing that shocked me is how wide a consensus that is.
Uh-huh.
Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also impressed at how good the right is at doing what they do. I think these Tea Party things, it's a really, really effective way of intervening in politics. And it seems actually from what I see of it, that those are there. The agenda is less a social agenda, and it's more a kind of fiscal conservatism, and which is very smart. It's let's not talk about. They don't talk about abortion. They don't talk about that stuff. They just are wanting to be responsible for the future of the kids, not to spend all this money. And then the interesting thing on, what was it, on April 15th or something around tax time, was that thing in the New York Times on the front page was a breakdown of the opinions, or just a survey of the opinions of the Tea Party members on. Did you see this thing? It was pretty interesting because they basically didn't have a lot of complaints about how they were being taxed. They just were uncomfortable with so much going to African American poor people. So in the end, it's race, right?
Sure.
And in the end, it's race. But they found a way to make it look like it's just a conversation about the economy, and they're good at it, So all the swing voters, and let's remember how that's the thing in America always. You get a president, but half the country. Almost half the country thought that that Palin would have been an okay vice president. Can you imagine? I mean, it's amazing, right? So
after 8 years of Bush paving the way,
unbelievable. And so I've just somehow they're and somehow the Democrats in turn are really bad at being in power, and so I think that the right wing is good at organizing. They're good at grassroots democracy. Mm-hmm. They're good at getting the moms out to bake chocolate chip cookies, way early in the morning, so everyone at any kind of gathering is, when they're just good at it. From the details to this thing of switching the agenda right now, slightly away from the social, from the sort of social policy agenda, and then the Democrats have this problem with power, and the left does have a problem with power, right? And that is historically the case. And we talk a lot about this, the kind of in the academy and in a pedagogic situation and in sort of teaching institutions, the role of authority. And so the left and the role of authority and this really problematic relationship to authority that you see, and on the left, and I think that was that's playing out, right?
Yeah. Well, the way one of the people I interviewed put it, he said, the right is always preparing the ground, and the left is always trying to plant seeds. So even if we plant the seeds, it can only grow in a hostile environment because they've been preparing the ground for 3 decades. So, going back to the anti-government stuff, starting with the tax revolt of the 70s, basically 40 years of really hostile environment being kind of purposely cultivated to automatically kind of combat any worthy idea that progressives might come up with.
And I'm amazed at the blatancy of it. The fact that Fox News can show footage from a different season for some march on Washington to make it look like it was a big march. I mean, the blatancy of lying and the effectiveness of it and the kind of insouciance about that. And it's okay. They've also figured out how the media works, and they're really smart about those things. Very, very smart about those things. And seems to be working for them.
The irony, I mean, it's basically Soviet, isn't it?
Is what?
Soviet.
Oh, what do you mean?
Airbrushing history.
Yeah, exactly.
Airbrushing
Completely.
Exactly. I was thinking about that during Katrina when Bush finally went down there, and he got some photo ops in front of some cranes, and they were doing nothing, but these cranes were moving stuff around, and it looked like,
Right.
he had rolled up his sleeves, and
Yeah.
Right.
and then the cameras went off and the cranes stopped,
Right.
and that was that.
Right. No. They construct all of these Potemkin villages.
But I feel like I was raised to despise that because I was raised in the Cold War, right?
Right.
Well, is there anything that we haven't touched on that we should have?
I don't know by what agenda.
Well, let me put it this way: is there anything that you wish you had said that you haven't?
I don't know. Any conversation is a fragment, so it's okay for it to be a fragment.
Yeah, it has to be that way.
Yeah, it has to be that way.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you. Cues. 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 Cues.